So the chair would call up H.R. 5510 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 5510, to amend the Federal Trade Commission Act to establish new requirements relating to investigations, consent orders, and reporting requirements, and for other purposes.
So I would just say, without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Just say that the speaker is signing the the enrollment process for the opioid bill at 10:30. I'm told that he invited all the conferees to that. It's a brief ceremony. So a number of us will be going over to the Capitol and returning. So I hope to roll, if any votes are ordered, hope to roll votes until that's done, but it shouldn't take very long. Let me ask first if there's any bipartisan amendments to the bill. Seeing none, I know that we have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to be offered by, no, it's an amendment. The amendment, or the gentleman from Texas has an amendment?
Yes, technical corrections to the bill.
Technical corrections. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Which number?
Dr. Burgess.
Are you doing the two? Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. Burgess.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is technical in nature. It clarifies the intention that our legislation only requires the Commission to publish an economic analysis or advice by the Bureau of Economics if the Commission has already prepared the advice or analysis. We accomplish this clarification by breaking the two-sentence provision in Section 5 into 2 paragraphs to more clearly indicate that if no advice or no analysis is prepared, all that is required is a statement saying so. This clarification should remove doubt as to the section's intent and ensure that it is read as intended. I urge a yes vote on the amendment. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the Burgess amendment, which is technical in nature. Seeing none, the vote occurs on the Burgess amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion share. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, is recognized to offer an amendment. Number?
Mine is 307, yeah.
307.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. Pallone.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last month at a subcommittee hearing on privacy and internet service providers, we heard the majority complain about the Federal Communications Commission's recent proposed rule to ensure broadband providers keep consumer information private. I support the FCC's desire to do more to protect consumers. Unfortunately, critics of the FCC came out quickly in opposition to the proposal before they even knew the details. They say that the FCC's proposed privacy rules are fatally flawed because they only reach broadband providers, not websites or social media. I agree that protecting consumers across the internet ecosystem is important as well, and that's why I'm offering an amendment today that could help ensure that every company in that system protects an individual's personal information. My amendment allows the FTC to draft rules requiring those websites and social media sites also to protect consumer information. This amendment would even the playing field by giving FTC regular rulemaking authority under the Administrative Procedure Act, the same rulemaking authority that applies to the FCC with regard to consumer privacy and data security. In the face of uncertainty created by a company's privacy policies, nearly 70% of Internet users would prefer the government do more to protect their personal information. Consumers want more protection, not less. Americans are worried about their privacy and security online. Giving the FTC authority to adopt new rules would help ensure our privacy is safe no matter where we go on the Internet or how we connect. And when consumers are safe, we're all better off. If the majority's concern about FCC's privacy proposal is the disparate treatment of ISPs compared to edge providers, my amendment is a common sense solution. The answer is not to lower the standards, it's to raise the standards for all, and so I would urge a yes vote on this amendment, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word to speak against the amendment.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's been long recognized that the Federal Trade Commission is a unique federal enforcement body with a significantly broad jurisdiction over the commerce in the United States of America. Because of the position of the Federal Trade Commission, Congress has continually declined, and this is on a bipartisan basis, Congress has declined to grant the Federal Trade Commission general rulemaking authority. It is designed primarily as an enforcement agency, not as a regulatory agency. Rulemaking authority for the Federal Trade Commission for data security and privacy matters is in fact a slippery slope. It is unnecessary, and in fact it is bad public policy. This committee has considered specific data security legislation that did not include rulemaking authority when it was approved and reported to the House floor. I oppose this amendment. I encourage my colleagues to oppose it as well, but support the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, the gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support the ranking member's amendment, but I'd like to make some general comments on the direction that we're going first. H.R. 5510 is one of 4 bills regarding the Federal Trade Commission that we're considering in this markup. These are actually the first bills to come out of the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee since last July. The Federal Trade Commission defends competition and protects consumers from unfair and deceptive practices. We heard repeatedly in a Telecom subcommittee hearing last month how much the FTC protects consumers, and John Leibowitz, one of the majority witnesses and former head of the FTC, observed both sides of the aisle have praise for the FTC. We should be strengthening the FTC if it is working, but H.R. 5510, the FTC Process and Transparency Reform Act, does the opposite. H.R. 5510 would make it harder for the FTC to protect a violation of the law. The bill would limit the FTC's ability to bring cases to protect consumer privacy. It would cut the length of consent decrees that stop repeated bad behavior. It would bog down the FTC by forcing it to more frequently review and renew its actions, and it would require time-consuming economic analyses for recommendations made to outside entities, effectively preventing the FTC from providing the consumer perspective. Cutting the FTC enforcement abilities and stretching its resources would mean less protection for consumers and, therefore, more victims of deceptive advertising and unfair business practices. My Democratic colleagues and I will be offering several amendments, this is one of them, to point out the various ways that the FTC should be strengthened and that consumers would be put at risk by this bill. As the ranking member of the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee, I urge my colleagues to put the interests of consumers first and reject the legislation. On this specific amendment, the FTC has relatively limited authority to protect consumer privacy, and this bill, in its current form, would make that narrower. At the same time, consumers face more and more threats to their privacy as new technologies develop. Right now, the FTC relies on individual enforcement action. This amendment would allow the FTC to conduct rulemakings under the administrative This amendment would allow the FTC to conduct rulemakings under the Administrative Procedure Act, specifically in the area of privacy. Rulemaking authority would provide stronger protection for privacy, empowering the FTC to better serve consumers. I urge my colleagues to support the Pallone amendment, and I will either yield to a colleague or yield back my time. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Bilrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes
Members
no.
wishing to cast a vote, Mr. Sarbanes.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Kathy McMorris Rogers.
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no.
Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden votes no.
Other members, Mr. Harper.
Mr. Harper votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote or change a vote? Seeing none, clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 ayes and 27 noes.
17 ayes, 27 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Carriers 02.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. McNerney.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendments, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Trade Commission is tasked with protecting American consumers against unfair and deceptive practices in the marketplace. H.R. 5510 would undermine the FTC's protection of consumers, which has been the core of the agency's mission for over 100 years. From making it easier to terminate investigations to limiting the length of consent decrees, this bill would put consumers at greater risk. Consumers deserve better than that. My amendment puts consumers front and center by lifting the outdated telecommunications common carrier exemption to the FTC Act. Today, due to this exemption, the FTC is unable to bring enforcement actions against telecommunications company for unfair and deceptive practices. Once this exemption is lifted, consumers will benefit from shared jurisdiction over common carriers between the FTC and the FCC. Not only does each agency have unique expertise to offer, but each agency also provides consumers with different redress. Now, just a little while ago, Mr. Liebitz, former head of the FTC, testifying before this committee at the majority's request, said that he believes the common carrier exemption should be lifted. My amendment will lift the exemption, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes to speak in opposition to the amendment. Light touch regulation has enabled us to build a thriving digital economy that is flexible, nimble, and adaptable to a constantly evolving market. This light touch regulatory framework has actually encouraged job creation, it encourages economic growth, and it's enabled a rapid pace of innovation that we all enjoy today. Eliminating the common carrier exemption would give two agencies, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, rights to regulate common carriers, which could result in duplicative, redundant, and inconsistent regulations. I don't need to spell out for you what that would do to economic growth. While under the right conditions, elimination of the common carrier exemption in the FTC Act could be something that would be supportable moving forward on this legislation following the Federal Communications Commission's reclassification of broadnet internet service providers would do more to jeopardize the stability and future growth of the internet economy by subjecting the industry to regulations from two federal agencies. This could also lead to greater uncertainty in the marketplace and increased litigation. Moreover, it would create additional competitive disadvantages amongst companies within the internet ecosystem. While the Memorandum of Understanding between the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission pledges to avoid duplicative, redundant, and inconsistent regulations and protecting consumers in the public interest, the Memorandum of Understanding is not binding. The Federal Communications Commission has been increasingly engaged in mission creep over the years, issuing enforcement actions in a handful of data privacy and security cases. There is no confidence that should the common carrier exemption be lifted here, that the Federal Communications Commission would defer to the Federal Trade Commission, the expert agency on data privacy and security matters, to address these issues. Instead, the Federal Communications Commission would likely continue attempts to expand its authority and place arbitrary standards on companies that are innovating, investing, and driving our economy. Therefore, eliminating the common carrier exemption to the Federal Trade Commission at a time of massive and abusive regulatory mission creep by the Federal Communications Commission would do more to harm consumers and the internet economy than it would strengthen. Prepared to yield to any other member on the Republican side. Seeing none, I will yield back. Are there other members seeking recognition on the amendment? The gentlelady from Illinois, for what purposes she seek recognition?
I move to strike the last words.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
As we saw and heard in a recent Telecom subcommittee hearing, Republicans on this committee actually expressed preference for the approach the FTC has taken to broadband privacy. But under the Open Internet Order, the jurisdiction over broadband privacy has now moved entirely to the Federal Communications Commission. But there is a simple solution, and that's the McNerney Amendment. If we want to maintain the special, the specific, and different tools that the FTC has over broadband privacy and make sure that consumers are fully protected. We could adopt the McNerney Amendment and give the FTC jurisdiction over common carriers. This is a very simple, elegant solution, and we should adopt it. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield to Mr. McNerney.
I just want to bring up a couple of points. What we have here is a conflict between consumer protection on the one hand and giving companies as much leeway as possible so they can innovate on the other hand. I think my amendment strikes the right balance. Now, what we hear is that there's, between the FTC and the FCC, some inability to work together, but that's not the case. We have several cases where the FTC and the FCC have worked together on the do not call, on the antitrust, on enforcement and regulation of deceptive practices involving cable companies. So we have plenty of precedent that those two agencies are able to work together to find the right balance. Now, if the common carrier exemption is not lifted, then we have the FTC is not given the power and authority it needs to protect customers and consumers. So I asked my colleagues to consider, do we want to really open up consumers to that much potential abuse? And with that, anyone else wishing to speak? I'll yield back to the gentlewoman from Illinois. And she yields back. I yield back on her behalf.
Chair, thanks. The gentleman and gentlelady yields back. Seeing no... for what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To support the amendment, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes supporting the
Thank you.
amendment.
I just want to make an observation. As the ranking member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, we have the whole issue of privacy on the table. And poll after poll, most especially the Pew, which is, I think, one of the most reputable in the country, has come out with definitive information where the American people want more privacy, not less. Now, the majority has taken a position on this issue of privacy and this tug of war here with the FCC. We had the FCC here earlier this week at the subcommittee to testify. There were many questions about the issue of privacy. And not for privacy at all. I mean, really and truly, not for it. And if there's going to be an eensy-weensy bit of privacy, then most definitely it should go over to the agency that will do such a superb job on this, the FTC. You love the FTC for privacy. Today, you're wrecking the FTC. So, you know, sometimes we say hypocrisy. I think this is political cross-dressing. I think you have to make up your minds about what you want to do with and where you are on one of the essential issues in our country, which is privacy, and follow the law about not only who's going to implement it, but also, you know, to say on one day of the week that the FTC is terrific and capable and durable and historically has done these things and done them so well, and now it is, today is the day where you just take the FTC apart. And it's pretty stark to me. And I'm just tracking what I've experienced this week. And I think that this should be made part of the record because, you know what? We can't have it both ways. Can't have it both ways. And I think we're skating on thin ice here. Agencies have responsibilities. It's up to us to make sure that those responsibilities under the law and the statutes under which they operate, that they operate appropriately under those statutes, whomever has that obligation and responsibility. But this is, I think this is a first in my experience because it's so stark, the starkness of it. So I know it's tough talk, but it's the way I see it. So I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
To support the McNerney amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
I know we've had a lot of discussion on this, but I really think it's very important because the underlying bill does nothing to help consumers, and we shouldn't be holding the FTC back. We should instead be ensuring the highest levels of consumer protection, and Mr. McNerney's amendment takes a crucial step in that direction by giving the FTC oversight authority over communications common carriers. Because there currently is a common carrier exception, consumers of telecommunications services do not benefit from the same prohibitions against deceptive and unfair practices in the FTC Act that apply to almost every other sector of the economy. For example, if the exception was lifted, the FTC would be able, again, to use its authority against companies that promise their customers unlimited data, but instead reduced or throttled the data speeds of high-usage customers to the point that many common mobile phone applications like web browsing, GPS navigation, and streaming video become difficult or nearly impossible to use. And lifting the common carrier exemption also would allow the FTC to use its considerable expertise in deceptive advertising, marketing claims, and billing issues to protect consumers from unfair or deceptive acts by common carriers, including Internet service providers. Doing away with the common carrier exception will also allow FTC to have enforcement authority over ISPs as it does for websites and social media. So this amendment brings the ISPs back under the FTC jurisdiction as requested last month by the majority and its witnesses at a committee hearing on the FCC's privacy proposal. The amendment allows for seamless cooperation between the FTC and FCC. Each agency has expertise and abilities that the other does not. For example, in enforcement cases, the FTC can seek consumer redress and give money back to consumers, something the FCC does not do. So by lifting the common carrier exemption, the agencies can work together to put consumers first. I don't really understand why this amendment is even controversial. I mean, it's really important to consumers, and I urge my colleagues to support the McNerney amendment. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? For what purpose the gentleman from North Carolina, for what purpose he seek recognition?
Have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment. FCC comments amendment.
01.
01.
Amendment to H.R. 5510 offered by Mr. Butterfield.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize the hour is late. I'll talk very, very quickly. Mr. Chairman, my amendment today builds on the one that I offered at the CMT subcommittee markup that was actually accepted by a voice vote. The amendment pointed out that under the original language of this bill, the FTC would have been effectively forced to spend countless hours producing a written economic analysis before responding to any request recommendations from members of this committee. My amendment I offered in the subcommittee created an exception for all members of Congress to this onerous requirement. My amendment today is a simple one and another attempt to help clear things up in this section of the majority's bill. This amendment would create another exception to Section 5 of the bill. This time it would apply for all agencies within the government. I'm sure this was yet another oversight by the majority because I know my colleagues recently praised the FTC's comments to the FCC on privacy. The amendment would ensure the FTC retains its ability to offer expert recommendations to other agencies within the government without the burdensome requirement of first producing a written economic analysis. My amendment cuts away bureaucratic red tape, something I'm sure all of us would appreciate. My amendment is simple, straightforward. I ask my colleagues to vote for it. I would ask the majority to even accept it. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. And just for clarification, there is no requirement in H.R. 5510 that the FTC must conduct an economic analysis. That said, in the cooperative spirit of moving things along, the chair is happy to accept this amendment.
You're very kind, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
So the vote will then occur on the Butterfield amendment. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. Tonko.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Section 5 of the bill that we're considering would require that the staff at the Federal Trade Commission publish an economic analysis with any recommendations to outside parties. This provision would do nothing to make the FTC's Bureau of Economics more engaged in commission business, and this requirement would not make the FTC consider more closely economics when issuing advice. This provision is only meant to gum up the works at the FTC when interacting with others. This bill masquerades as a reform measure when, in fact, it will only serve to stop the FTC from issuing advice altogether. The rest of the world looks to the FTC to provide sound consumer protection and competition-related advice, and rightly so. We should be proud that state, federal, and international policymakers frequently call upon the FTC. There are already 3 exceptions to this provision. My amendment would add another critically important exception. Many of us have followed the press reports as European and U.S. negotiators reached an agreement on cross-border data flows, the EU-U.S. Privacy Shield, which was just approved this Tuesday. But that agreement would not have been possible without the hard work and significant contributions of the staff at the Federal Trade Commission. Had the majority's bill been law during those negotiations, however, we may have never been able to come to an agreement. If it becomes law, this bill would stop the FTC from providing additional comments on the Privacy Shield as questions develop. I know that can't be the intent of my Republican colleagues, so I'm baffled that they're taking this approach. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment to protect this fundamental FTC function, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment, and again to clarify, there is no requirement in H.R. 5510 that the Federal Trade Commission must conduct an economic analysis, but once again, in the spirit of cooperation and moving things along, the chair will be happy to accept this amendment. If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there further amendments to the bill? Mr. Rush from Illinois.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can keep the ball rolling in a positive way, since you have agreed.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I do have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. Rush.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
I'm so excited, Mr. Chairman, about the possibility of this agreement. The amendment I have is really straightforward. Simply put, it ends what is commonly known as the nonprofit exemption, and it gives the FTC authority over nonprofit organizations exempt from taxation under the Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, rather. The question has been raised about the need for such a change since the IRS does a sufficient job of regulating nonprofits. The argument against this, Mr. Chairman, is that one, that on both sides of the aisle, the FTC is the preeminent consumer protection agency in this country, and its expertise at securing privacy rights is unparalleled. Mr. Chairman, as the Identity Theft Resource Center reported, in 2014, 42.5% of all data breaches occurred in the medical healthcare industry, an industry that counts many nonprofit entities in its ranks, entities that, under current law, are outside of the purview of the FTC. Thus far, Mr. Chairman, in 2016, over 2.6 million health records have been breached. With so much personal information for so many Americans is at risk, or in some unfortunate cases has been leaked, will it not make sense to do all that is possible to ensure that this sensitive information is protected? Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, my amendment, if adopted, will allow the FTC to go after the bad actors in the nonprofit world, those organizations claiming to be nonprofits when they really are nothing but a sham. Organizations such as these not only hurt the consumers through their deceptions, but the cause they purport to represent by misdirecting money away from worthy, legitimate organizations. Mr. Chairman, while it is true that the FTC can pursue these bad actors under the Section 5 authority, this is a cumbersome process that consumes much of the FTC's resources, a process that therefore leaves many bad actors to continue their nefarious ways. In short, Mr. Chairman, my amendment provides an important step forward in protecting American consumers, and I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes to speak against the amendment. One of the FTC's most visible, highly visible nationwide cases in the last 2 years was against a series of charities, the sham charities, that ended up taking almost $200 million from people they thought were donating money to help breast cancer patients and families. Stopping sham charities is an important piece of the Federal Trade Commission's anti-fraud portfolio. Just 2 months ago, the last of these two sham charities, the Cancer Fund of America and Cancer Support Services, settled the cases against them by agreeing to shut down and liquidate all of their assets. Nonprofits have been exempted from a number of federal laws, mainly income tax, but all the way to the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, because of the legal distinctions made in their structure and purpose. 501c3 exempts entities organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing, and for public safety, literary, or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports competition, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. This amendment would impose unintentional costs on universities and other nonprofits that are exclusively operated for the purposes stated above. Most of these institutions are already on tight budgets. This amendment is a major expansion of the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction, when the balance of the package we are considering today is aimed at improving transparency, and we have not examined the full unintentional impacts of sweeping all of the nonprofits under the Federal Trade Commission's umbrella, or if there are duplicative regulatory impacts given that other reporting of nonprofits given their tax-exempt status. This amendment is a major regulatory expansion for small nonprofits that are providing critical services for communities around the country. Certainly, if there needs to be further discussion, there needs to be further examination of all of the ways that a blanket expansion of the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction would impact these small and medium nonprofits who provide benefits for the poor, veterans, and children. prepared to yield to anyone else on the Republican side who wishes to speak against the amendment. Seeing none, I will yield back my time. Further discussion on the amendment. I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois. 5 minutes to speak again. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman and Chairman of our subcommittee, you cited exactly the examples I wanted to cite. That is, 2 cancer charities that scam donors out of a lot of money, and the FTC reached a settlement with them. That was good. But in general, it is difficult for the FTC to stop sham nonprofits. And that's why we need the Rush Amendment. Because the FTC does not have jurisdiction over nonprofits, it has to first prove that the organization is not truly a nonprofit before it can address the unfair or deceptive practices, and that also and also the issue of not protecting privacy, which are these very 2 important protections that consumers need. So the Rush Amendment would empower the FTC to better protect consumers, exactly what we should be doing, rather than undermining the agency. There is no new paperwork required for small or medium nonprofits. It just means that they have to be careful not to scam consumers and not to put at risk their privacy. Why wouldn't we want to do that? I certainly urge all my colleagues to support the very sensible Rush Amendment. And I yield to any Democratic colleague. No, seeing none, I yield back my time.
Chair, thanks. The gentlelady yields back. Are there further members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman for what purposes? Gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition.
To support the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment takes the right approach by supporting the FTC's efforts instead of inhibiting its ability to carry out its mission of protecting consumers. It just puts the FTC on the bill before us, I should say, just puts the FTC on the wrong track. If we want to help consumers, we should be giving the FTC additional tools, not raiding its tool shed. And Mr. Rush's amendment gives the FTC one additional tool, and that's authority over nonprofit corporations. Just to give you a couple examples, right now there are scammers that have formed fake veterans charities to scam Americans who want to help veterans, and the FTC can't bring those bad actors to justice until it first goes to court and demonstrates that the fake nonprofit corporation is really not a for-profit corporation. And in the meantime, thousands of Americans are being scammed, and thousands of hours pass as thousands of dollars are wasted, and those dollars are not going to the veterans who could use them. Another problem is in the area of data security. As we've seen, data breaches occur regularly. While many organizations and companies put in place reasonable measures to reduce the risk of these breaches, some failed to meet basic best practices, and right now the FTC can't ensure nonprofits have these basic best practices, but can make those demands on for-profit companies. In fact, last spring, the majority supported giving the FTC jurisdiction over a nonprofit organization in its data breach notification bill that was passed out of the full committee, and the Rush Amendment would help reduce data security problems in this country. So this is an amendment is supported by the bipartisan FTC commissioners. It increases their ability to protect consumers, and I just, again, urge my colleagues to support it so the FTC can go after these unscrupulous actors in the marketplace, however they are incorporated. It really shouldn't matter. We need to work together, Mr. Chairman, for American consumers, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote on this amendment. The roll call vote has been requested on the amendment as per the further agreement between the chairman and ranking member. That vote will be postponed until after the enrollment ceremony. Are there other members seeking, for what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
SLW 309.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Ms. Clark.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member. Mr. Chairman, the 8-year limit on consent decrees is a seriously problematic provision in this bill. In subcommittee, I highlighted how the provision would adversely impact our seniors. In fact, it would weaken protections for all consumers, including minority communities who've been targeted by scammers of all kinds. In a report released by the FTC last year, the Commission noted that African American and Hispanic consumers were more likely than non-Hispanic whites to report having been victims of certain kinds of frauds. The schemes that affect minority communities often focus on income and debt. Scams like bogus work-from-home opportunities, business opportunity fraud, and the credit repair, debt relief, and mortgage relief scams. And the 8-year limit just serves to put these consumers at even more risk. Limiting consent decrees would also undermine the deterrent effect that FTC enforcement actions have. Longer consent orders not only stop repeated bad actors by the original offenders, they serve as a deterrent to the other potential offenders. Because the Commission does not have general civil penalty authority, consent orders are often the only remedy available, even for the most egregious cases. Even when large numbers of consumers are harmed or when the consumer injury is especially serious. Moreover, the 8-year cap on consent decrees is counterintuitive. It seeks to help industry by limiting most consent decrees to 8 years. Yet the result could be the FTC may choose to take more of these cases to court if it feels its hands are tied. The FTC could lose its incentive to settle, especially in cases that affect minority communities, which have been particularly vulnerable to scammers. Needlessly tying up enforcement actions in long court battles could take crucial resources away from other work by the Commission to protect consumers. Well, this entire provision, this entire bill harms consumers, including the minority communities that are so often targeted. My amendment will make a small dent, but will ensure that the FTC can do more to protect minorities. While I was unable to ensure seniors are protected during the subcommittee markup, I have not given up the fight to improve this bill. Let's support this amendment so FTC can get on with its job of stopping bad actors that target minority communities. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair would recognize himself for 5 minutes to speak against the amendment. And first I want to say I understand the desire to provide protections for vulnerable classes of consumers. We've recognized the importance of protecting vulnerable groups with various provisions in the bill, such as our provisions dealing with seniors. However, this amendment is crafted in a way that would eclipse the requirements in the bill. It is important to limit consent orders for cases that don't involve fraud or likely recidivists. This amendment is not narrowly tailored. It would apply to any case targeting or affecting minority communities. Clearly, this could apply to all and any and all cases. And so agreeing to it would amount to deleting the provision that was drafted into the bill that would undo the important purpose of ensuring that not all consent orders run for a full 2 decades. You know, when we had our hearing and markup on the bill, the FTC's testimony about their 20-year consent order practice, the only example of alleged changes to the consent order length were that 2 orders had 10-year audit requirements. The consent orders were still 20 years long. The Federal Trade Commission cannot refute that the 20-year length is inevitable for companies. The Federal Trade Commission also claims that companies can ask for their consent order to be reviewed at any point, but the record or lack thereof of companies taking that route over the last several decades makes it clear that that is no choice at all. So the real question is, did the FTC begin an investigation into your business practices, and has the FTC offered you the choice, and choice is an operative word there, to negotiate a settlement, or will the FTC file a civil case, in civil court? If the answer to those questions is yes, then your company has entered a new world where a 20-year consent order with no judicial review or oversight, unless multi-year litigation at a likely loss of millions of dollars, is the only option for your business. And that is no option for a business, because no business can sustain that. And we've had examples of that recently. LabMD, an example where the real costs of litigating against the Federal Trade Commission, the company's gone. It is shut down. Years after the original investigation, the administrative law judge's decision in favor of LabMD in September of last year is as far as the process has moved. The court found in favor of the lab. They weren't guilty of any of the charges leveled against them, except, oh, I'm sorry, your business is now gone because you spent so much time dealing with the Federal Trade Commission. Look, one of the strengths of the internet is that it touches on many cross-sections of society. We certainly need to be careful not to make special rules where if someone who happens to belong to a certain group is affected, then the rules of general applicability don't apply. Such an approach would effectively set the commission free to do at its own discretion in all instances under the guise of protecting certain constituencies. I want to stress that I appreciate the spirit of the amendment, but I don't think it's a workable approach, and the limitation on consent decrees is an important one, and so I will urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment, and I will yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking time on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
To strike the last word
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
and to support Congresswoman Clark's amendment, which would certainly help protect communities of color who are disproportionately the target of bad actors. Consent decrees are critical to stopping these bad actors, and we need the full 20 years to truly have a deterrent effect. There's something seriously wrong when we prioritize those who victimize above those who are victims of unfair and deceptive practices. I want to thank Congresswoman Clark for offering this amendment. It shows yet another example of those who Republicans are putting at risk with this dangerous anti-consumer. And let me just say that at the end of the day, all consumers matter and are affected by this legislation, and we should support the wise amendment of Congresswoman Clark. And I would yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Are there other members seeking time on the amendment? If not, the vote. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Support the Clark amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
As was mentioned by Ms. Clark, there was a recent FTC survey that found that African Americans and Hispanics were significantly more likely to be the victims of fraud. And under current FTC practice, if a bad actor uses false pretenses to obtain personal or financial information from a minority, that bad actor could be prohibited by an FTC consent decree from using false pretenses for up to 20 years. And since the FTC can't impose financial penalties, the ability to stop the bad action preying on minority communities is currently its best weapon. The other option is not to settle through a consent decree. Instead, the FTC can bring the scammer to court, and we heard at the subcommittee hearing a few weeks ago what can happen in a court of law, a permanent injunction, not the negotiated one of 20 years that we're debating today. Under the bill before us, the FTC would only be able to negotiate 8-year consent decrees with scammers and fraudsters that target minority communities. That makes no sense. Consent means both sides agree. The accused bad actor has negotiated and agreed to the terms of the consent decree. The accused and its legal representative have decided that this agreement is better than going to court. And the consent decree provision of the bill is terrible for all consumers, not just for minorities. It would put an enormous strain on the FTC's resources. It requires a mandatory 5-year review of all non-fraud cases, and there's no definition of fraud in the bill, so every single consent decree could have to be reviewed. The proposal shifts the burden to the agency to justify the continuation of the decree and that shift is unwarranted and could result in more court challenges of these reviews.
Next vote is.
Mr. Chairman, consumers suffer if FTC staff time has to be dedicated to these reviews and the staff can't be working to stop or prevent new bad acts. Furthermore, consent decrees should be encouraged, not discouraged. They can be negotiated and agreed to faster than a case can be litigated in court, so the consumer harm, such as scams against minorities, stops sooner. And as the Consumer Union, the Policy Arm of Consumer Reports just wrote, and I quote, "This bill would undermine the FTC's ability to prevent repeat offenses." So I hope my colleagues will join us in supporting the Clark Amendment, so at least scams targeting minorities can be prevented for longer than 5 or 6 years. 5 or 8 years, I should say. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Ms. Clark. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. Veterans 01.
And
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. McNerney.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This one seems to be a no-brainer, and I hope I can convince the majority to go along with it. I'm trying to speak on behalf of veterans here. My amendment ensures that when the FTC enters a consent decree involving unfair and deceptive practices targeting veterans, the consent decree will not be subject to that 8-year cap. Consent decrees are one of FTC's most vital tools for deterring unfair and deceptive practices in the marketplace and protecting consumers. By entering into a binding agreement, with the FTC, a company agrees to specific reforms in its practices subject to penalties for violations. The FTC has brought up at least 10 enforcement actions in federal court for serious recurring violations of consent decrees that were over 15 years old. Clearly, this experience demonstrates the need to protect consumers through consent decrees that extend well beyond the 8 years. Our nation's veterans are often targets of some of the most egregious deceptive practices. Many of these cases involve schemes to defraud veterans in matters regarding their application for enhanced pensions with aid and attendance. Entering into a consent decree that is too short puts veterans at greater risk that the bad actor will engage in repeated violations. My amendment ensures that veterans who have fought and sacrificed, and their families have sacrificed, to protect our country receive the highest level of consumer protection. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members wishing to speak, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And certainly we all understand the desire to protect our nation's veterans, and I don't think there's anyone on this committee who argues with that. However, there are many consumer protection agencies that are working diligently to protect the interest of all consumers. These consumer protection agencies do not have special protections for certain groups of people. Doing so may have the unintended effect of harming consumers that don't fall within those special classes and are therefore not able to benefit from the protection. As with other amendments we have had under consideration today, this creates a dangerous precedent to call for additional protections for some groups but not for others. This amendment is well intended, but ultimately it is not workable. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, but yes on the underlying bill. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I think that's probably the first time I've heard that an amendment that would protect veterans is dangerous. And this amendment actually would be kind of a trimmed down, slimmed down idea that, yes, to me it's unthinkable that we would put the interests of those who target veterans with deceptive schemes above the interests of those who have bravely served our country and actually protected us from danger. Consent decrees have a long time span for a good reason. Their primary role is deterrence. Section 3 of this bill undermines that deterrent effect. And our veterans, it seems to me, deserve strong consumer protection. We do single out veterans many times in many ways, and this modest amendment, it seems to me, is quite the opposite of dangerous and well worthy of all of our support. And I would yield back to anyone. Just yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I also want to indicate support for the McNerney amendment. Fraud, as we know, affects every community. However, veterans can be at increased risk because once they're not working as a full-time military person, they have to find a place to live and a job, and they sometimes have more uncertainty in their lives for a short period of time after being discharged from the service. And the list of scams on veterans is shocking. Unscrupulous debt collectors prey on those who have or had instability in their lives. Scams like free phones for veterans, advances on your pension, or car title loans for veterans. These are all very common. And we've seen certain for-profit schools looking to make money off of veterans' education benefits make deceptive claims about their job placement rates. So under current FTC practice, if a bad actor commits a deceptive act against a veteran, he could be prohibited by an FTC consent decree from committing that deceptive act for 20 years. And since the FTC can't impose financial penalties, the ability to stop the bad action preying on veterans is currently its best weapon. So under the bill before us, the FTC would only be able to negotiate 8-year consent decrees with scammers and fraudsters that target veterans, and that, to me, it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, the consent decree provision is terrible for all consumers, not only for veterans, but at least we should pass the McNerney Amendment so that the one agency created to protect consumers can continue its important work of going after those who try to scam our veterans. So I would ask that we at least try to prevent these scams against veterans by supporting the McNerney Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion your noes have roll call vote is asked for, requested. So we will vote now. Roll call vote on the McNerney amendment, followed immediately by the rolled vote on Mr. Rush's amendment. So we'll have 2 recorded votes back to back, and the clerk will call the roll on the McNerney amendment first.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Bilrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members, Ms. McMorris Rogers,
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no.
Mr. Shimkus,
Mr. Shimkus votes no.
Mr. Welch,
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Dr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Remember, members, we have an immediate roll call vote following on Mr. Rush's amendment, which was rolled.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes, 25 noes.
19 ayes, 25 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will now call the roll on the Rush amendment, which was rolled from earlier this morning. Okay.
Mr. Barton. No. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. No. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. No. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. No. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mr. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Bilrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Pallone.
Aye.
Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Aye. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Aye. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes no.
How's Ms. Kathy McMorris Rogers?
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote or change a vote? Seeing none, clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 25 noes.
20 ayes, 25 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentility from Illinois has an amendment at the desk, and the clerk will report the title of the amendment. It's number 02, I believe.
It is 02.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill weakens the FTC's ability to protect consumers under the guise of process reform. One of the most glaring examples is how the bill limits the kind of harm the FTC can pursue when it goes after unlawful acts and practices. Section 2 of the bill calls on the FTC to dismiss harm that is, quote, merely speculative, unquote, and it asks the FTC to consider whether the harm is a financial, a health or safety risk, or, quote, only emotional or other more subjective harm. This dismissive attitude toward certain kinds of harm is very troubling, and if this language were enacted, it could discourage the FTC from taking action in cases where consumers' privacy or data security is at stake. My amendment would preserve existing FTC authority regarding privacy and data security, excluding them from this callous balancing test that disadvantages non-economic harm. Supporters of this bill may claim that the bill just codifies the FTC's 1980 unfairness statement, but it does not codify the doctrine in full, and that will affect actual cases. In our Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee hearing, David Vladeck, former director of the FTC's Consumer Protection Division, opposed this provision and this position, mentioning that the 2012 designer wear case, rental companies were using the software on computers that they rented out to consumers. And this software allowed the companies to remotely track the location of the computers, but also take pictures through the computer's webcams. This cyber peeping invaded consumer privacy. The companies urging this software using this software could take pictures of children and adults unaware that their activities were being watched. There may not have been financial harm or an immediate risk to health and safety. In the words of this bill, families experience, quote, just emotional or other more subjective harm, unquote. I think most Americans would agree with me that this exactly is the type of case where we want strong consumer watchdogs to take action. But as Professor Vladeck testified, this is the type of case where the FTC would be less likely to bring the case if the bill were enacted. When I asked John Leibowitz, former chair of the FTC and a Republican witness in a recent Telecom hearing, about selectively codifying parts of the unfairness statement, he expressed concern about proposals that hamstrung, quote, hamstrung the FTC, unquote. I think most people would think that cyber peeping, allowing a company to take pictures, to go into your home and really snoop on you and do it legally is a problem. And I urge members not to hamstring the FTC and to adopt my amendment, which would reject this bill's dismissive attitude toward non-economic harm and stand up for consumer privacy. And I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, to speak on this.
Mr. Chairman, I wish to speak against the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I want to be very clear here that the amendment that we're considering would alter current law. The portion of the bill this amendment alters is a restatement of current law. Under current law, the Commission must meet a balancing test to bring an unfairness case. This balancing test is under Section 5N of the Federal Trade Act. This amendment would exempt data security or privacy cases from the current balancing test with references to cases similar to DesignWare or TrendNet.
maintains.
Under current law, the commission brought complaints against Designware and TrendNet and settled those cases. Those cases didn't need a special exception. The Federal Trade Commission is equipped to bring those cases.
Okay.
This bill does not alter the balancing test, so the amendment is in fact not necessary. The amendment would undo the work the Commission has done under its current statutory authority to bring data security and privacy cases. The Commission would need to start all over again, but this time not moored from Section 5N. The Commission won its case against Wyndham Hotels. The Third Circuit upheld that the Commission's authority to prohibit unfair practices involving data security. It is, in fact, unnecessary to carve data security out of Section 5N. This amendment exempts certain cases from the current balancing test required of the Federal Trade Commission in unfairness cases. It is not an amendment that is undoing anything new in the bill. It is an amendment. It is an amendment undoing current law. And further, I just want to say that the ranking member of the subcommittee mentioned the Designware case several times, and the TrendNet case was also discussed at the subcommittee markup. I think it's important that people understand why H.R. 5510 does not change and encourages the Federal Trade Commission's ability to bring cases against bad actors who violate consumers' privacy. H.R. 5510 does not change the Federal Trade Commission's ability to bring these types of cases. And I want to be clear and on the record that those types of cases are critically important for the Federal Trade Commission to be able to pursue them. H.R. 5510 would not bar the FTC from bringing a case where harm has not yet resulted from the acts or practices at issue in the case. In fact, the bill clearly states that an act or practice may be likely, and the may be likely is in quotes, to cause substantial injury if the Commission can show a significant risk of concrete harm. Significant risk means exactly what it says. And although the harm may have yet to have occurred, there is a significant risk present that it will result. A risk of something happening means that something has not happened yet. This is a common sense definition. I'm not aware of anyone who would argue that a computer rental company secretly spying on people in their homes is trivial or speculative. I certainly would not make that argument. I also don't know who would make an argument that someone snooping doesn't raise a significant risk of harm to consumers. It most certainly does. So long as the Commission can meet this test, and as far as I am aware, this current analysis performed by the Federal Trade Commission, it certainly should be able to bring and win cases involving harm that hasn't necessarily resulted from the act or practice yet. I urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment and support the underlying Bill 5510, and I will yield back my time to the chairman.
Excuse me, would the gentleman yield for a clarification?
Yes.
Thank you. The amendment was specifically redrafted to make sure that it actually does address the existing piece of legislation, does not existing FTC regulations does not change that at all. It is, it took into account that concern, and this is not new law. This is maintaining the powers of the Federal Trade Commission. And the other thing I wanted to just point out that while you may feel that the Designware case is not one that wouldn't be considered, David Vladek, who is actually the former director of the FTC's Consumer Protection Division, particularly cited this as one that would put consumers, or certainly could put consumers at risk under the language that was added. The doctrine in full
Mr. Chairman, I'll
has not
reclaim
been
my time.
codified.
Expired and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Yes, and I'll yield to Mr. Kowski.
Thank you. Let me just finish my sentence. The legislation, as we see it, actually does, in fact, change the law and change the powers of the FTC. It does not codify the doctrine in full. And so, in fact, it is the Republican version that changes the law, and this amendment that I offer would make sure that it does not change the current law and the current powers of the FTC. I think that is a very important distinction to be made. Thank you.
I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Other members, gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
I just want to emphasize what the gentlewoman from Illinois just said. I don't understand what the gentleman how the gentleman from Texas says that her amendment changes the law. I think it's just the opposite. The bill changes the current law, and hers keeps the protections under the law for this group of individuals. So I support the amendment because at least if this amendment passes, we'll know that the FTC will not have to rely on economic harm to protect the privacy of children and babies, the most vulnerable in our society. We heard during the subcommittee hearing a few weeks ago that the FTC used its unfairness authority to go after a company that was spying on children in their cribs. And in that case, the harm was not economic. It was the emotional or other more subjective harm the bill is trying to condemn. And these kinds of privacy cases demonstrate the holes created by this bill. Supporters of the substantial injury provision in the bill argue that those provisions are harmless because they simply codify parts of the FTC's own unfairness statement that was published in 1980. But it's only codifying select portions of the unfairness statement, ignoring the parts that allow for the flexibility the FTC needs to protect consumers. In fact, rather than clarifying the FTC's use of its unfairness authority, this provision disregards the rest of the unfairness statement, which provides more info and more direction to businesses trying to avoid unfair acts. And the bill also ignores parts of the unfairness statement that would make it very difficult for the FTC to continue helping consumers by preventing harms. The very core of the FTC's mission is laid out in Section 5 of the FTC Act, which states that the Commission is empowered and directed to prevent the use of unfair methods of competition and unfair or deceptive acts or practices. But the unfairness provision would obliterate that statutory directive and needlessly put consumers at risk. The substantial injury requirements in this bill are not harmless. Peeping Tom cases will be harder to bring. The Schakowsky Amendment will slightly limit this bill's efforts to gut the FTC. Do not allow the authors of this bill to take the preeminent consumer protection agency and prevent it from protecting consumers. That's why you have to support the Schakowsky Amendment. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Other amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy has an amendment. The clerk will read the title.
Amendment to H.R. 5510, offered by Mr. Kennedy.
The amendment will be considered as read. Staff will distribute the amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The FTC's mission statement reads, and I quote, "To prevent business practices that are anti-competitive or deceptive or unfair to consumers, to enhance informed consumer choice and public understanding of the competitive process, and to accomplish this without unduly burdening legitimate business activity." Further, the FTC's vision seeks to accomplish, quote, "A U.S. economy characterized by vigorous competition amongst producers and consumers, access to accurate information, yielding high quality products at low prices and encouraging efficiency, innovation, and consumer choice." Mr. Chairman, this bill flies in the face of allowing the FTC to do its job, protecting consumers while providing vigorous competition in the marketplace. The underlying bill does several things undermining the agency's ability to be a voice for consumer protection. For example, it prohibits the FTC from declaring an act or practice unfair unless it is likely to cause concrete harm in the form of economic harm or health or safety risk. It limits FTC's enforcement authorities by allowing companies to use general compliance with agency guidelines as a defense. It limits the FTC's ability to investigate fraud by setting arbitrary timelines. These are just a handful of the problematic requirements of this bill, tipping the scales to the business community at the expense of vulnerable consumers. That's why I'm offering this amendment today, to reaffirm the FTC's commitment to the values and mission expressed in the statements I read previously. The amendment simply reads, quote, "Nothing in this act may be construed to affect the authority of the Commission to act in the interest of consumers." The FTC's work is invaluable in protecting consumers across the country. from unfair and deceptive acts that take advantage of unsuspecting and innocent persons. The FTC provides a check on these practices to ensure that consumers have a voice and someone is watching their backs. We must make clear today that this bill, being offered under the guise of process and transparency, does not undercut the values forming the basis of the existence of the FTC, consumer protection. I urge a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield to Mishikowski.
I'd like to just repeat again the language of this amendment. Nothing in this act may be construed to affect the authority of the Commission to act in the interest of consumers. So that language is, in fact, a restatement of the mission of the Federal Trade Commission. So let's be clear. If you vote against this amendment, you are conceding that provisions of the bill would impair the FTC's ability to carry out its mission. And if that's not the case, then you should have no issue voting for the Kennedy Amendment. Unfortunately, the bill itself is a thinly veiled attempt to tie the FTC's hand as it defends competition and protects consumers. And I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this simple amendment which restates the function of the Federal Trade Commission and that ensures that the FTC's critical work on behalf of consumers is in fact protected. And I yield back to the gentleman.
If there's any other Democrat that wants my time, unless seeing none, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, would announce that this is likely to be the last amendment offered to the bill. So, gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, recognized for 5 minutes.
Did the chairman request that I make that announcement, or has the chairman already made that announcement?
I made the announcement. This is likely the last amendment.
Very well. I seek time in opposition. Mr. Chairman, the kindest thing I can say about this amendment is that it's not necessary. So I'll stop there with the kindest thing I can say. The bill, and this is important, it's important for everyone to understand, the bill does not limit the Federal Trade Commission from pursuing consumer protection authority. But it does clarify that the FTC's process should be open, it should be transparent, and it should be fair. Fair for consumers, fair for companies that are impacted by what is a very large federal agency with an unlimited time horizon to aggravate you. The goal of this amendment is to undo the entirety of the bill. So I'm going to oppose the amendment. I remain fully confident that the FTC will remain a large government agency and it will continue to fulfill its consumer protection mission. I yield back to the chair.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to thank the gentleman for his kindness.
The chair would recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a good amendment, and I strongly support the Kennedy Amendment. But, you know, even with the amendments that have been adopted, it's not going to be enough to save this anti-consumer bill. There's simply no justification for gutting the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission does an outstanding job protecting consumers by rooting out fraudsters and scammers, often working with our local law enforcement officials and state law enforcement officials. And I thought I'd give you just a few examples. They're not hard to find. These are just a few examples from back home in the Tampa Bay area in Florida. Let me just read them to you. First one, this is from June of 2013. The Federal Trade Commission levied a civil penalty of $7.5 million on a St. Petersburg-based home lender, Mortgage Investors Corporation, the largest fine ever for a violation of the do not call telemarketing rule. What they did, they called more than 5.4 million phone numbers listed on the do not call registry to pitch home loan refinancing services to current and former members of the U.S. military. As part of the pitch, the telemarketers led service members to believe they could receive low-interest, fixed-rate mortgages at no cost, often quoting rates that they implied would last the duration of the loan. But in reality, regulators said the company was only offering adjustable-rate mortgages, which left consumers and our military members liable for higher payments with rising interest rates and closing costs. Further, the FTC said mortgage investors allegedly misled consumers about a corporate affiliation with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. That makes me angry, and that should make you all angry. The FTC went after them. The company, after a consent decree filed with the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Florida, barred the company from calling people on the Do Not Call registry and denied, doesn't let them go use these consumer specific requests. They're also barred from misrepresenting any terms related to affiliations with the VA. Here's another one from June 2015. At the request of the Federal Trade Commission, a federal district court has temporarily halted an Orlando-based operation that has been bombarding consumers since 2011 with massive robocall campaigns designed to trick them into paying up front for worthless credit card interest rate reduction programs. The court order stops the illegal calls, many of which targeted seniors, and claimed to be from credit card services and card member services. The defendants charged those seniors and consumers up to $4,900 for their non-existent services. This was a scam that blasted robocalls to our older neighbors and offered bogus solutions to relieve credit card debt, said Jessica Rich, director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection. Doing business as Payless Solutions, the defendants were illegally calling thousands of consumers nationwide, including seniors, claiming that their program will save them $2,500 in a short period of time. Then they would charge their credit cards. Thank goodness the FTC is out there going after these scam artists. Here's another one from just April of this year. The Federal Trade Commission went after an education lead generation company in Orlando, Expand Inc., and its owner. The FTC found that this company has been claiming to visitors to its websites that it's pre-screening of job applicants, when in fact it was gathering personal information for other purposes and then selling it to for-profit colleges. They represented, you know what, this is not innovation, this is scam. This is a scam. They represented themselves out there in the world as a dynamic tech company. They're not a dynamic tech company, they're fraudsters. Here's another one from just last month. The Federal Trade Commission has charged a Clearwater firm and its owner with allegedly bilking at least $1.3 million from small businesses by pretending to be a federal agency. This group allegedly operated a telemarketing scheme that tricked small businesses into believing they were the Occupational Safety and Health Administration or another government agency, then scared them into thinking that their firms were not compliant with federal law. The FTC's complaint said that this Clearwater-based firm sold the small businesses services they didn't need, like government posters they said they had to have. This scheme began in 2011. The FTC went after them, and then telemarketers cold called these owners and deceptively lured them into these unfair trade practices. The court entered a restraining order and froze their assets. This is not economic growth. This is not innovation. These are scam artists. This is not a clarifying bill. It's one that proposes to take the cops off the beat to the detriment of our neighbors back home. And I think we need to adopt the Kennedy Amendment. It's not going to save the bill. However, vote against the bill in the end. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to briefly echo Ms. Castor's statements about the Kennedy Amendment. This entire bill flies in the face of the FTC's consumer protection mission. The bill pits the interests of industry against the interests of consumers, and under the bill, the consumers lose. Mr. Kennedy's amendment would help to curb some of the unintended consequences of the bill by preserving the FTC's authority to act in the best interests of consumers. And the amendment simply ensures that protecting consumers from anti-competitive or unfair and deceptive practices continues to be the priority of the country's leading consumer protection agency. I don't understand, again, this should not be contentious. And again, I encourage all my colleagues to join us in supporting this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Ms. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Ms. Brooks. Ms. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
How's Dr. Murphy recorded?
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Ms. McMorris Rogers?
Ms. McMorris Rogers votes no.
Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Johnson votes no.
Mr. Kramer?
Mr. Kramer votes no.
Mr. Lujan?
Mr. Lujan votes aye.
Other members wishing to change their vote or cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. How's Mr. Bilrakis recorded?
Mr. Bilrakis is not recorded. Mr. Bilrakis votes no.
How's Mr. Green recorded?
Mr. Green is not recorded.
Mr. Green votes aye.
Mr. Green votes aye.
How is Mr. Pitts recorded?
Mr. Pitts is not recorded. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 21 ayes, 28 noes.
21 ayes, 28 noes. The amendment is defeated. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, roll call has been requested for final passage. Those in favor of voting for H.R. 5510 as amended will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Ms. McMorris Rogers. Ms. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Bilrakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Ms. Brooks. Ms. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Lobsack. Mr. Lobsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote or change their vote? Clerk will will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 29 ayes and 20 noes.
29 ayes, 21 nays. The bill as amended is adopted. I'm sorry, 29-20. I'm sorry. Oh, how is the gentleman from Texas recorded? The gentleman from Texas votes aye.
Mr. Barton votes aye.
So let me get a new tally. Are those for everybody at the on the dais?
He clocked in at 19 minutes and 20 seconds.
19 minutes and 20 seconds. No. Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 30 ayes and 20 noes.
30 ayes, 20 noes. The bill as amended is adopted. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to all the legislation approved by the committee during the markup. So ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
And I'll yield to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'm giving notice of our intention to file minority views for inclusion in any legislative reports that this committee forwards to the House on those measures we've considered. Under that rule, the minority is accorded not less than 2 additional calendar days to file its views with the committee clerk. I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.